is one of the many, many steps to having equality,
Yeah.
Equal protection under the law.
Yeah.
Something that doesn't seem to get covered greatly when they talk about, well, civil unions are the same as marriage. It's like, frequently not, because there's so many places that reference marriage in company policies, never mind laws, and it's
Sure.
very difficult to actually create separate but equal entities.
Yeah, it doesn't quite work, does it? It's never really equal. We have discovered this, that certainly this is no surprise, that there are an awful lot of little things that wind up costing you money, for instance.
Oh, speaking of which, in the same state, on the other side of the issue, income tax fairness has been stripped from a New York budget bill.
Really?
A provision that would have allowed married same-sex couples in New York to file state income taxes jointly was stripped from a budget bill because of opposition. Without going through the whole thing, it needs to be noted that the problem is in the way the New York State tax code is written. You have to file the same status on your state taxes as you have filed for your federal tax return.
Right.
And since, because of DOMA, you cannot file your federal tax return as married, even if you've been married, it means you can't file it in New York as well. And since, as we just said, New York recognizes same-sex marriages made out of state, they want to be able to let you file as a married couple if you were married out of state living in New York. And it got stripped out.
That's too bad. That is too bad, but hopefully at some point in the future.
And what it really boiled down to, this bill, was decoupling the two. So basically it was just to say, you don't have to file your state status the same as you file your federal status.
Yeah,
That's what they were trying to do.
I think is a common requirement for state income taxes, that you have to, everything has to sort of be the same.
Mm.
I believe that's how it is in Connecticut, but it doesn't, at this point, it doesn't really matter. But I think that's a fairly common requirement.
Yeah,
So,
Governor Patterson.
anyway.
But so, on a positive note, the UN Human Rights Chief commends Iceland for legalizing gay marriage.
Yeah.
Another reason to love Iceland.
Iceland's very cool.
My cousin and his new wife just went on their honeymoon to
Yes.
Iceland, and they had a great time.
Yeah. Yeah, they were telling us all about it.
Yes. Sean and Kristen.
Yep.
The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights visited, and she commended Iceland for the significant progress it has achieved through recent legislation removing legal impediments to same-sex marriage, as well as becoming the 7th European country to legalize same-sex marriage. Iceland is the first to have an out gay head of government. Johanna Sigurdardóttir.
Icelandic names are
Sigurdardóttir, which is a daughter of Sigurd, roughly, became prime minister last April when her Social Democrats formed a left-wing coalition with the left-green movement. That's, Americans aren't used to these kinds of political entities, I understand.
Sure.
Social Democrats and Catholic Democrats are both democratic, but they're different from our Democrats. Iceland, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, a couple months ago, she married her partner.
How cool is that?
So an out lesbian prime minister of Iceland marrying her partner.
Yeah.
The first lady has a first lady.
Wow. That is so cool. I mean, my hat's off to Iceland, really. What a cool place. It's a place that I've always wanted to visit also. Probably because I was always a Jules Verne fan, and I was always, Journey to the Center of the Earth was always one of my favorites, and of course it starts in Iceland. Well, it starts in Scotland, winds up in Iceland, but and then winds up eventually in Italy. But anyway. But they spend a lot of time in Reykjavik and descending into the volcanoes and stuff. But Iceland is a very cool place, and it's so nice. Good for them. Now, if we could just get our own country to sort of follow suit.
Well, and the problem there is going to be with folks like Mr. Mike Huckabee, the Republican 2012 presidential candidate, says he does not support same-sex marriage, partly because of the quote-unquote ick factor. Male and female are biologically compatible to have a relationship, he says. We can get into the ick factor, but the fact is two men in a relationship, two women in a relationship, biologically that just doesn't work the same.
Oh, God. Give me a break.
Understandable maybe from where he's coming from that the only thing that matters is the ability to procreate.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there are a lot of married couples, opposite-sex married couples in this country that have no desire to have children that fall into the same exclusion that he's making here.
Yeah.
If you define a successful marriage by the production of children, then you exclude a lot of the existing opposite-sex couples out there.
Absolutely. I think that it's interesting, and the thing that I find icky about this is the fact that we're talking about the ick factor.
Well, and I think when I first read this to you, you pointed out the only way he's defining a quote-unquote relationship is through genital contact.
Yeah.
Nothing else matters in this context other than genital contact.
Yeah. What happened to love? Where does that come in?
Because when he says that two men or two women don't work the same way as a man and a woman, certainly when you talk about personalities and dominance in a relationship, you talk about power structure in a relationship, none of that's terribly different. What gets to be different is the genital contact.
Right.
And that's a very narrow and unfortunate way to define a relationship, strictly by genital contact and whether you can produce children.
Kind of makes me have to wonder what his relationships are like.
Well, and
I'm sorry.
And as pointed out by the Human Rights Campaign vice president, the ick factor is actually when you're fired from a job, when you're the victim of a hate crime, or when you're bullied at school because you or your parent is lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgendered. Ick is certainly an appropriate way to describe Mr. Huckabee's mind going to sex when all that we were asking about is equality in relationships.
Yes. Well put.
And to cite how off the mark Mr. Huckabee is in a lot of these, they go on to quote what he said in the last several years on different occasions, saying that gay parents adopting children is like giving them puppies. It says children are not puppies, that gay couples shouldn't be allowed to have them because children are not puppies.
Wow.
Well, I mean, that must mean that adoptive parents of any kind are also equally unqualified if they're not blood related to the child. He said homosexuality was an aberrant, unnatural, and sinful lifestyle. He calls AIDS patients carriers of the plague and added that they should be isolated from society. These are not mainstream comments, even though people like to think he's a fairly mainstream. Even for conservatives, these are not hugely mainstream comments. And when he talks about same-sex marriage, and he's wrong on the historical view of marriage, but marriage has historically never meant anything other than a man and a woman. It has never meant two men, two women, a man and his pet, or a man and his whole herd of pets.
Yeah. Definitely an icky mind.
Yes.
Wow.
So that's...
Dare I say an idiot? I'm sorry. Was that out loud?
He's a charismatic guy, and because of that, people think what comes out of his mouth must be meaningful. And unfortunately, along the ick factor, the Texas GOP announced the 2010 Texas Republican Party platform. And, Mike Huckabee would be at home here. going far beyond what most conservatives think is reasonable. I would say far right of most any of the conservatives I've met in this part of the country, that they agree with him that gay people should not have custody of children. But they push that so far as, you know, if you're gay and you're in a marriage, you shouldn't have custody of your own biological kid either. You just can't be trusted. It says that issuing a marriage license or performing a marriage ceremony for a same-sex couple should be punished by jail time.
Wow.
It wants to restore the 19th century Texas statute outlawing sex between men. Quoted saying, "Homosexuality tears at the fabric of society, contributes to the breakdown of the family unit, and leads to the spread of dangerous communicable diseases. Homosexuality must not be presented as an acceptable, quote-unquote, alternative lifestyle in our public education policy. We oppose the recognition and granting of benefits to people who represent themselves as domestic partners without being legally married." They're not just against marriage equality, they're against equal rights. They think it should be legal to fire someone for being LGBT. Even their word choice, they say, is possibly anti-transgender bias, using the phrase natural men and natural women in their platform.
Wow.
They don't stop by attacking LGBT citizens. They also call for evicting the United Nations from the U.S., requiring driver's licenses to indicate citizenship, opposing legislation to allow stem cell research, rescinding no-fault divorce, and reversing Roe v. Wade, and shutting down the U.S. Department of Education.
Wow. Wow.
So, as I said, pretty much all the conservatives, even the ones I don't agree with up here in this part of the country, seem to have very reasonable minds, and the Texas Republican Party platform seems to be way, way right of any conservative I know.
Yeah, wow. That's amazing.
Having stirred all that up, we have a caller.
Yeah, let's take this call. Good evening, NLC Trans. You're on the air.
Yes, you stated earlier that it was historically wrong. Can you tell me what you're basing that on?
Oh, the marriage?
For marriage?
Yes, I basically agree with at least most of the statements you've read. Because I truly believe marriage is between a man and a woman, but you stated that's historically wrong. Can you tell me what you're basing that on? And and your viewpoint on...
I'm sorry, we got
some feedback there.
Serious feedback. I think we lost our caller.
Okay, if you can stay away from the TV and repeat the last part of the question.
Yeah, and your viewpoint on bisexuality.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, basically,
Thank you.
The research that I did on marriage basically takes it back to property rights. Marriage was a way of establishing heritage and lineage. It was a way of saying, I have access to this womb and anything that comes out of it. It was a way of protecting your property in order to build your family assets, so that if you had an estate or you had a farm, it would be passed down to your family. It would not go back to the state. The notion of marriage as anything other than a property rights contract didn't really come into play until the 1500s. And at that point, it was romantic writers who were talking about chaste marriage, chaste love. The church got involved through the